Rupert Brooke occupies a somewhat original space in the field of English poets. He had a very brief and somewhat adventurous life and a fairly slim output as a poet, and yet he has retained a certain celebrity quality, and not unearned in poetic sense. He was an English poet. Obviously, he was a lieutenant in the Royal Navy, born the middle class son of a headmaster of the famed rugby school. He set up a certain tenor for what became known as the Georgian poets in English letters. Because of the education that he got at rugby, he moved on to Cambridge, where he studied classics or greats, and he befriended Virginia Woolf and others of the Bloomsbury group. He moved in fairly poetic circles with Yeats and Robert Frost. He is grouped today with the Georgian poets, a small group of individuals who clustered around that white-hot center of culture in metropolitan England. And they experimented largely with pastoral themes in the rural English countryside, and went about themselves as a kind of iconoclastic neo-pagans, as they have been called. Now, Brooke was notoriously good-looking, and he had several affairs throughout his brief life with both women and men. Some of these started to take a toll on him over time. He had a mental crisis in 1912 and spent several months in an institution. Then he traveled for a full year, somewhat far afield. He traveled to Germany, he went to Canada and the US, and even made it to Tahiti. Some of his interesting work comes out of that. Upon the outbreak of World War I, however, that's when his career started to take off. He joined the Royal Navy, and by the age of 27, he had gained notice from none other than Winston Churchill for his poetry, and one of his poems was read from the pulpit of St. Paul's Cathedral on Easter Sunday, a showcase that would be the envy of just about every young poet in the land, certainly. He died a few weeks later, however, after an infected mosquito bite took hold, and he died on a troop ship off the coast of Greece. The cause is generally considered sepsis. Now, Brooke primarily wrote sonnets. His most notable is titled "The Soldier," and that's the one that got read from the pulpit of St. Paul's. But it first appeared in the Times Literary Supplement a couple months before his death, and then came out as a posthumous publication later that year. And it is the cornerstone of his legacy in English letters. If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, a dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware, gave once her flowers to love, her ways to roam, a body of England's, breathing English air, washed by the rivers, blessed by sons of home. And think, this heart, all evil shed away, a pulse in the eternal mind, no less gives somewhere back the thoughts by England given. Her sights and sounds, dreams happy as her day, and laughter learnt of friends, and gentleness in hearts of peace, under an English heaven. That's a sonnet. It's a little irregular in the phrasing of it, but it is a fairly conventional sonnet in its way. It is a kind of love poem, addressing an imagined grateful nation back home. It follows both a Shakespearean and Petrarchan sonnet form in the rhyme scheme. You can also see it being a little on the jingoistic side. Brooke's work is often derided as naive and sentimental. It reflects an idealism and enthusiasm of English youth at the start of the war, and they are swept up by nationalist patriotism. And it's only going to be a little bit later, as it always is, that the realities of war tends to dampen that enthusiasm and the scars start to set in. But Brooke, characterizes this moment before all that, when it's all just an adventure. Now, the poem hinges on this relationship this one soldier has with his countrymen. The soldier seems to yearn breathlessly for the chance to prove himself through sacrifice, which here is drawn as a kind of idealistic apotheosis. But it's also individualized as the poem dwells upon the physicality of the man. A dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware, gave once her flowers to love, her ways to roam, a body of England's breathing English air, washed by the rivers, blessed by the sons of home. These are corporeal. This is very concrete, very imaginable. And it stands in some contrast to a lot of his other work. This one poem is the fifth and final in a sequence that got published together in his posthumous publication. And it is titled 1914, and this is the most famous one of them. But the others are a little bit vague. They are a little bit abstract. And this one, because of its anchoring in physicality, rises above those others. It is more moving. It is more graspable in its sentiment, and so it stands out. Now, also in this poem is one thing that is very interesting is, I would say, the diction and phrasing, the artificial trappings of poetry speak that had become so prevalent in the Victorian era and certainly in the aestheticism school. That is all stripped away here. This is all very simple language. There's not a single big word in there. It is all very easy to understand, and so also very popular. It could be grasped by just about anybody. And that puts it in line with certain currents that were going on. Yeats was largely doing that with his friend Ezra Pound from America, and they're stripping those cute little curly cues of language that would pop up in poetry to signal that, oh, okay, this is poetry here. And this poem, Brooke, does away with a lot of that. It is spoken English language, but it's not necessarily original to that either, because that's basically what Wordsworth and Coleridge were doing in the Romantic age. The commas are also, I would say, very significant in this poem because it has a kind of halting effect. There is a spoken quality to this that comes with a kind of overexcitedness. The commas and the clauses come tripping over one another. The breathlessness that results implies the kind of scattershot excitement of the very young at a moment of adventure. That ending sestet is particularly fractured in a way that is hinting almost at the modernist style taking shape. But you can also see for its time the characteristic Georgianism of the hedon, the hedonistic quality. The poetic voice strives to immerse itself in a kind of patriotism, in a spirit of the war that is almost a platonic experience of the ideal. And think, this heart, all evil shed away, a pulse in the eternal mind, no less gives something back the thoughts by England given. This is a kind of ecstasy. This is an excitement that is palpable as the poem imagines disembodiment or union with the eternal mind. It nudges close to a kind of Emersonian or Jungian oversoul that can redistribute the thoughts by England given into a kind of universal animating spirit. The fracturing, again, it also implies a kind of delirium where you can't quite finish a sentence, where you can't quite connect one thing to another. It's all just tumbling out as if the poem is drunk on itself. But the poem does have some clear messaging going on here. It is a stirring poetic apostrophe, and this was recognized immediately for its propagandistic value. This is one of the factors that certainly got it chosen for recitation at St. Paul's, to stir the patriotism and the volunteerism of the young and public support generally behind the war. And this is something that, this is 1915. This is something that every country does to try and stir up some support for the great challenge ahead, knowing that, okay, that spirit is going to crash hard down the line, but for right now we need to rally the numbers behind this, rally support. And the noble youth heroically offering himself for the greater glory of this nation captured a prevailing tone of England at the time. And because he was giving voice to that, Brooke became fixed in a kind of image of youthful idealism and patriotism, and became a very public symbol of that youthful energy. And so when he dies, just that spring, he would be mourned as a kind of symbolic loss of innocence. England invested in him as a sign of, okay, let's go get him. But his almost immediate death kind of put the kind of soured that note a little bit. But still, the sentimentality behind it could also then be turned as a kind of propagandistic tool, even as the war and the destruction and the death was dragging on. You can also see colonial aspects of the late British Empire here, where the soldier in question is, in a sense, conquering foreign lands by dying on them. The soldier declares that wherever he might be killed in battle, then that territory would become rightfully owned by England. It's an interesting little sentiment that was, of course, would meet with great approval, let's say, by the young Winston Churchill, who wanted to perpetuate the British Empire. But coming as it does in World War I, just at the beginning, that has a certain ironic note, because World War I is generally considered an end point of the British Empire, and that thought was probably not part of the original thing, certainly, but as the 20th century creaked on in those early decades, that would become something that would have more meaning for later readers, intended or not. But this poem, Brooke's work in general, remains popular today for its energetic lyricism and unabashed youthfulness. Brooke never got the chance to grow jaded. He captures a spirit of romanticism and joy that would soon go up in flames as the war and destruction dominated the first half of that century. And so he has an historical value for embodying the moment, for personifying a spirit in public discourse. But nobody can deny that his sweeping language and clear imagery raises this admittedly thin body of work to impressive heights of poetic art.